With payday fast approaching, state workers are wondering whether the check will be in the mail. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues Magazine and WUIS. And with me today is Professor Kent Redfield, Professor of Political Science from UIS. Professor, glad you're here.
Good to be here.
And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Good to see you again, Andy.
Great to be here.
So we've got a lot to talk about this week. The budget battle rages on, and Governor Bruce Rauner has reintroduced some of his turnaround agenda as legislation. He had a big press conference this week to kind of re-roll these things out. Most of them are things we've seen before, but he has a new pension bill that's quite comprehensive. Professor Redfield, can you tell us a little bit about what the governor is proposing here?
Well, the turnaround agenda items involving workers' comp, tort reform, property tax freeze, and term limits, and the redistricting reform are all basically the same proposals. The pension is new. It is an attempt to address the state's pension debt by introducing the idea of consideration, of offering current employees some kind of benefits in exchange for modifying the pension provisions that they're currently under. This is aimed at Tier 1 people. It's also aimed at trying to provide relief specifically for the Chicago school system, the teachers, with the Chicago teachers, but also police and fire. And so there are provisions that deal directly with Chicago, but there are broader provisions that deal with every person with all of the state's pension systems. And there, in addition to the changes involving pension benefits, trying to find something constitutional in that area, there are also provisions that address and limit collective bargaining, both at the state and the local level. And so there are things in there that are very controversial, and what kind of fate that's going to meet within the current impasse. It doesn't appear to have moved things very far. He's indicated in his press conference that this had things that involved this county board president, Tony Preckwinkle, the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Emanuel, and John Collerton, the Senate president. He attributed some of the ideas to them, but all three of them indicated that they had no hand in writing the legislation, and that certainly didn't represent some kind of an agreement. And so whether we've moved things very far, it doesn't look like that was kind of the deal breaker that suddenly we're going to get out of this mess.
Yeah, Andy, you're in the State House. What kind of response did you see after the governor's press conference? I think folks were maybe a little surprised that he was rolling all this stuff out again and dropped this huge pension proposal just kind of in people's laps. What did folks have to say about it?
Right, and it was interesting too. I mean, it was such as Professor Redfield, it's very comprehensive. I think 500 pages, and it seemed as if he had put this out to reporters and the general public before kind of talking to the leaders and the other lawmakers and saying, hey, I'm thinking about putting all this stuff together. So I think some folks were confused. I think once they dug into some of the items on collective bargaining and those types of things, they pretty frustrated, especially if you're talking about the union folks. But I think it was at best unclear about how this is sort of moving the debate in terms of the budget, in terms of eventually they hope getting a pension compromise, and sort of what exactly this was aimed at. I mean, it's a big bill, there's a lot of stuff in it, but as far as we can tell, I mean, we had a spokeswoman for Senate President Collerton after the governor had said, this is part of the Senate president's language, his consideration idea. She's like, well, you're just paying lip service. It's not we didn't negotiate this. So it's tough to tell where exactly this moves the ball.
And the governor did say this week that pension reform being passed is not necessarily something that has to get done for him to consider new revenue for the budget. But he said he does need to see some parts of his turnaround agenda move forward. But at this point, we're seeing the budget battle shift to the fight over whether or not state workers are going to get paid. Andy, can you tell us a little bit about this? We're seeing this battle play out in the legislature as well as in the courts.
Right. And Attorney General Madigan, when it became sort of evident that we were going to go into the new fiscal year with no budget, went to the courts and said, this is what I think, this is who I think can get paid, but overall, most state employees, without appropriations, the comptroller doesn't have the authority to kind of issue those checks. So wanted to get court clarification. There was a suit in Cook County and another one that the unions filed in St. Clair County, but we had a decision on that issue in Cook County saying right now, the legislature can still be paid, legislative operations can still be paid, judicial operations can still be paid, but state workers have to be paid the minimum wage commensurate with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal law protecting those types of employees. But the problem is CMS and the comptroller's office aren't prepared to pay those wages and go through and determine, okay, you're covered by the law, you're not, et cetera, and dish out sort of that payment. So they said in court this would probably take like a year or maybe 9 months at best to figure out.
Mouse with the hamster wheel.
Right, exactly. and we've seen that before too, right? In 07 that happened. 09 they still weren't prepared to pay that type of those types of wages. So instead of paying them in full and trying to figure out in the meantime who deserves only the minimum wage, it looks like they're not going to be paid.
And at that time in 2007, the judge that made that ruling said, kind of, don't come back on this issue.
Don't try
Was
this
there
again.
any message from the courts as far as, why hasn't the state kind of gotten its stuff together to figure this problem out, or any warning that they should in the future, or just kind of looking at this is the way it's got to be because the computer system
right.
isn't
I think
what it could be.
I think it was such a strong message in 2007 that the AG arguably didn't want to try that maneuver again. And we had some insinuation that this was politics. Back in 07 we had Governor Blagojevich and it was all Democrats, and so the argument on the Republican side was, well, you Democrat Attorney General don't want the Democrats to take the blame for workers not being paid. Now that we have a Republican governor, you can shift the onus. But I think a lot of it had to do with the ruling in 2007 being so strong and saying, don't ever try this again, basically. Get your act together. But we've seen that still hasn't happened.
Well, and as many of our regular viewers know, we taped the show on Thursday, and as we were starting taping, the House was debating over a temporary budget extension that would fund some government services for a month and would pay state workers. It looked quite possible that might pass. We don't know for sure yet. But Professor Redfield, what's going on here with this focus on this 1 month fix and on paying workers? It seems to be drawing all the attention away from the larger problem is that we don't have a long-term budget for the current fiscal year.
Yeah, clearly the solution to all of this, to get it out of the courts and to resolve this, is to have a budget. But we're not willing to agree on exactly what are the non-budget items, or what does the overall budget look like and where are you getting the revenue. And actually pensions are part of this. You can't claim savings from a pension bill, which the governor did initially in his budget that he introduced back in March, was claiming pension savings. And so it's still, we're a long way from doing this. So trying to get people paid for a month, the governor is very strong on that. The Democrats have added an amendment to this bill to continue that, but the Democrats were also trying to provide money for social services. And so, the reality of a hard shutdown is nobody gets paid. If state workers get paid, but we're not paying social services, then maybe the Republicans think that puts more pressure on the Democrats. and the Democrats want to pay social services to relieve some of that pressure. They seem to also be willing to pay state employees for a month. So it seems to be more about who's getting blamed for how much we're not doing, rather than coming down to the hard decisions about what is or isn't non-negotiable as far as the non-budget items, the workers' comp, those sorts of things. And then, what are we going to spend and how are we going to pay for it? And we don't seem to be getting any closer to answering those questions.
In this temporary budget that Democrats are backing, Governor Rauner has said he would not sign it and that he considers it actually unconstitutional. Andy, what's his reasoning here for not supporting this and thinking that it's not the way to go?
Well, he has maintained for a long time that he doesn't want to sign a budget that spends more than you're taking in revenue-wise. The problem, as we all know, is because the income tax increase expired, and now we sort of have this ongoing hole to fill if we want to keep spending what we have been spending in previous years. Now, there is the argument on the Republican side and other side that there is a constitutional claim against taking in more revenue or paying more than the revenue that you take in, but it's typically been disregarded, and it people can say, well, we've estimated this much money, and that's kind of how they circumvent it a little bit. But that's sort of been Governor Rauner's main argument, is I'm not going to spend more than we have. And that's an argument that I think in general resonates and resonated in the previous election. But now you're starting to see, I think you'll see this is going to start being really real for a lot of people. If your paycheck isn't being delayed, it's one thing if you're talking about pension changes theoretically that could happen or other policies, but when people start getting their paychecks delayed, I think they start to pay more attention and things become a little bit more salient around here.
Yeah, that's a good point. Professor, you've watched these battles play out in the past, especially under Rod Blagojevich when it drug into the summer, and how does this compare to past budget battles, and what will it mean for this debate if employees do not get paid come, I believe, next week when they are supposed to get paid?
Well, and in past budget battles we have, we've either gotten a federal court order, or like we did in 2007, a state court order 2007, or we've had these kind of temporary budgets that we went through, and everybody kind of knew that there was a deal there somewhere, and that you were going to come together. And this looks even worse than 1991. In 91, there was a big conflict over cutting the state budget before we went to making the temporary income tax permanent, and with actually the Republican governor saying he would make it permanent if we'd agree to spending cuts. That got to the point where we were talking about Credit Union One, the local credit union in Springfield, loaning people money to make their mortgage payment. I was in that situation working for the university in 91. This looks much more serious because there really isn't the kind of communication and trust. You're not sure everybody is exactly in the same universe playing the same ball game, and that's what really makes this difficult. The governor said, well, I'm going to go against my core principles. I'm willing to raise taxes, and I don't like to raise taxes. Well, the analogy to that would be the Democrats saying, well, we don't really want to cut spending on social services, but we're willing to do that in order to get to a balanced budget. But the governor has this other set of items that involve changing the basic nature of collective bargaining, about changing workers' comp, about changing tort reform, which is another set of core beliefs that either the Democrats or their core constituencies have. And that makes it much more difficult to see where this comes together. And all of the rhetoric about, well, we need to have balanced budgets and we shouldn't appropriate more money than coming in. And then you kind of look backwards and you say, how did we, if we're always comply with the Constitution, how did we end up $6 billion in the hole? Because there's the comptroller saying, well, we're $6 billion in the hole, so any bills from 2015 that come in, we can pay because we've already appropriated money for them. We just didn't have it to spend at the time, and now we've got the money to pay old bills. So some of this is disingenuous on both sides.
Well, and that's a good point on the bills from last year. In some ways, Illinois' backlog of bills may be helping out some social service agencies right now because they can get paid money that they were owed from the last fiscal year. But what's happening to those groups? We're really focusing on the workers here. What about social service agencies, providers? What's going to happen to them if this drags on and on?
Well, and clearly, if you are in a position, a large agency that's been kind of floating the state, and so you've got months that are bills that are 6 months due, you're going to get some money for a while. If you don't have any margin and you don't have a contract and you don't have a guarantee of a contract, then you have to start shutting down operations. I mean, some of these things involve both volunteers and paid employees. But if you're talking about a non-for-profit that has a state grant to drive senior citizens to health, medical appointments, or drive dialysis patients to their dialysis, and you're talking about a rural county in Illinois, there are not a lot of options. If those services shut down and you don't have the volunteers to pick them up, then you're going to start to see some very serious kinds of problems. And so it's going to affect people that care about and have involvement with those social services. If the Secretary of State's office, Secretary of State furloughs everybody at driver's license facilities, all of a sudden you've got a problem, registering your car or transferring your title or getting your driver's license renewed. It does, state government does matter, and people that say, well, a shutdown won't affect me, clearly they haven't thought it through in terms of all of the things that state government does directly or funds through grants.
Well, that reminds me that my license plate registration is due soon, and maybe I should take care of that, and maybe everyone out there should take care of that as well. But Andy, the real pressure point right now is these paychecks, which we're looking at next week when those would go out. But they still have almost a week until they get to that point at the State House. That's a year. That's a lot of time to work on something. Are the leaders meeting? Are there conversations going on? Is there any work being done kind of behind the scenes that we could maybe see 11th hour Hail Mary 1 month something next week?
You can never, I think, foreclose the possibility of the Hail Mary. We've been in this situation roughly or approximately before, and the State House never ceases to surprise. But overtly, we haven't seen much beyond kind of the outward rhetoric, the Speaker having press conferences every single week, taking votes that Republicans say are sham votes and not real items on the governor's agenda. It hasn't really seemed to go beyond that, and there hasn't been a whole lot that they've agreed on that at least has come out in public. And most of what we see, I think the general public sees if they see the coverage or happen to tune in. So right now, I'd still say that a long-term deal is hard to foresee within a week's time. But like you mentioned, they've got they're probably voting on the temporary budget, and we'll see where it goes from there.
And if the governor, let's presume if that does pass, we don't know yet. Looks like it could, maybe it won't. If that does pass in the House, what happens next? Doesn't have to go back to the Senate. We've still got some time on the timeline of where that needs to go. Correct?
You have to send it, because you've amended it in the second chamber. You have to send it back to the first chamber. That can be done very quickly. You don't have to worry about reading bills on 3 separate days, those sorts of things. The real issue is the governor has 60 days to act on it. He can just wait out the clock and not do anything. He can veto it if it includes both workers' pay and social service spending, that makes it a little more difficult to explain, because he's also, in court, or the comptroller's in court, appealing the judge's ruling and trying to get people paid. And so that's a little bit of a, you put him in a difficult position. The governor a year ago during the campaign, clearly on record saying, that if we had to shut the state down to get things done, to get the turnaround, to shake up Springfield, then he would do it. He would be happy to do it. And so, I think that's clearly, a different kind of perspective than one assumed was in Rod Blagojevich's mind, or Jim Edgar's mind, or all of the different budget impasses that we've had. And so that makes it, trying to predict exactly how this is going to play out is difficult, because you're not entirely sure exactly what is the bottom line and what people are willing to accept as a good outcome.
Well, and I've noticed a lot of stories in the news over the last couple of weeks that note that lawmakers will continue to get paid no matter what happens. Andy, that's kind of it has its own backstory involving the courts and a fight with another governor. Can you tell us a little bit, for the folks out there probably wondering, why are these guys getting paid?
Right. So,
can you tell us why?
In the wake of the 2013 salary veto by Governor Quinn, when he was trying to force lawmakers to pass him a pension bill that he could sign, he
said,
vetoed their salaries, and said, you're not going to get paid until you get that work done. And essentially, the courts said that there's a separation of powers issue there, that the governor can't do that. Otherwise, why not use it for every single bill that he wants? And the legislature is reluctant to give him. But a year later, the legislature comes back and passes a bill. It dealt, I think, more overtly, if you go back and look at the debate, with fund transfers and giving the governor authority to transfer money from one fund to another. But one of the provisions made lawmaker salaries a continuing appropriation, basically meaning if the money wasn't there to fund lawmaker salaries for whatever reason at the same level as the previous fiscal year, then just assume that they can keep getting paid that same amount. Now, they also included judges in that legislation. It's not 100% clear that they needed to, because there is an argument that the judicial branch can kind of compel those payments anyway. But I think if you go back and look at when that bill passed, there wasn't much said about a continuing appropriation for lawmakers. And a year later, it comes to fruition where it's being utilized, and understand some of the anger about it.
And that's something that Governor Rauner is now proposing that the state do with state workers' payments, is to go ahead and set it up that way as well. But Andy kind of cuts to the heart of this. It's a separation of powers issue, right, Professor Redfield? That's part of the reason why this is such a difficult thing to tackle.
Yeah, and it probably would have been better just to rely on the courts, and if this comes up again, then the courts would address it in terms of it being unconstitutional for the executive to try and withhold the legislature's pay to somehow leverage. Because we're talking about is a provision in the state constitution that says you can't reduce the salary of an elected public official during their term in office. It would be unconstitutional for the legislature to not fund the governor's salary. I mean, it works in both directions. And continuing appropriations in terms of regular operations of state government are probably not a great idea. I mean, if you make all of the state budget a continuing appropriation, then there's no reason to actually have a budget. And frankly, a lot of what goes on at the federal level is just kind of stringing things along, with continuing appropriations and rolling things over. And there's, you read the federal law, Budget Act, it sounds like there should be a clear accountability and a settling up and a, moving from one fiscal year to the next. That doesn't turn out to be the case. And clearly in Illinois, if we made the system work correctly, you would get a accountability, a balancing up, a restraint on what we're doing. the sins are that we haven't done that, but solving that by taking more and more of the budget and putting it outside of any kind of pressure to actually make decisions probably isn't a good idea either.
Well, and the reason for those in the first place was for things that really need to get paid, right? Debt service, that kind of thing. Is that where they came about to begin with?
Yeah, and pension payments, and things in which there is a revenue source or a contractual obligation for things to get done. And so we certainly do those things, but there's no, a legislator's salary is guaranteed. A state worker's salary is not. I mean, if you have a continuing appropriation, that kind of assumes that everybody is entitled to their job, as we go along. And in fact, we know that that's not true. And so it probably, this wasn't a particularly, it doesn't look like it got a lot of thought. And now it's come back to be a political issue when it probably wasn't necessary in the first place. The courts were clear that, and so this was just kind of, one more little, superfluous, a little window dressing that now makes the legislature look bad.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to shift from the state level to the national level now because we had a congressional primary this week. Professor Redfield, can you tell us a little bit about this? It was in the 18th district, why the seat is empty, and who was vying for this seat?
Yeah, the seat was empty because Congressman Aaron Schock from the Peoria area resigned under an ethical cloud involving overspending and fraud in terms of his campaign fund, in terms of his district office allowance. And so that meant that the seat was open. Unlike a Senate seat where you often have a governor appoint someone to fill out a term, we never appoint replacements in the House of Representatives. It's always filled by an election. And so we have this election to replace Aaron Schock in a district.
And we're actually almost out of time. Can you just let us know who won both of the primaries? And no big surprise, really.
Yeah, I mean, LaHood won the primary as former state Senator Darren LaHood. He will win the general election. This is a district that is designed to elect a Republican. And so there's no surprise that when we get, when the election takes place in September, LaHood will win overwhelmingly.
Of course, he does have a Democratic challenger, and you never know, but it is a very Republican district.
Yeah,
so.
That's very unlikely.
All right, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guest, Professor Redfield. Andy, thank you for being here. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.